观众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场啊。那我们在思想先驱报中经常会为大家介绍一些比较新颖的观点。近期我特别关注到了 CSIS 布兰切特先生所主持的一个博客节目，他请到的呢正是 Gavekal 的中国经济研究总监巴腾森。那么其实呢，我对于巴腾森先生本身的研究工作就非常的关注，而同属于 Gavekal 的，不管是之前的路易斯盖夫先生，还是 Dan Wang 中国政策的分析者，也常常是我们思想先驱报讨论的话题。这一位巴森先生呢，他其实可以说是经历了多个媒体在《华尔街日报》曾经工作过，也曾经作为《纽约时报》的中国问题的报道专家和专栏作家。但是呢，他现在是就职于 Gavekal， 他在中国生活了非常多的时间，对于中国呢了解也非常的深。那么呢，这个布兰切特先生首先就问他一个问题就是说你到底怎么样看中国？如果你要用一句话来概括中国，你认为这个国家和别的国家不同的地方是什么？他是怎么说的呢？他说我认为有一件非常基本和简单的事情，你认识到这一点是非常重要的，就是中国人，大多数的中国人认为中国有一种使命感，是一个伟大的国家，应该走在世界的前列。他说说我的意思不是说中国人都是这种口吐白沫狂热的这种民族主义者。他说，但是一个问题是什么呢？在中国，不同阶层、不同政治信仰、左派、右派，各种各样的人中都有一个基本的一个假设，就是中国没有什么特别的原因不应该是成为走在世界先烈的国家。他有这样的一种使命感。如果中国现在很差，那么只要是做对了事情，它也可以成为世界上最好的。要么就是中国现在很好，未来很好，一定也会好。他说说我在中国生活的时候遇到这一种态度，因为作为一个美国人来讲，其实也不是那么的特别，因为美国人很多也有这样类似的心态。但是我在其他发展中国家和美国之外的其他发达国家的时候，我就发现中国的这一种态度是非常不寻常的。在很多的更小一些的国家，其实呢也是个富裕的国家，但是大家好像没有这么强的一个使命感，就是在任何一个世界上一定要成为世界第一没有这样的一种情节。比如说西班牙或者是印尼这样的国家，那这些国家都有发展的需求，但是它没有一种我是一个独特的，我这个国家是要完成某一种历史使命的这一种愿望。而在巴森先生看来这不仅仅是一种态度，或者是中国人的普遍心态，可能已经成为了中国现在领导层的一种政治信仰人生为一大事来，要实现一个重要的目标，中国存在在这个世界上是有某一种使命和注定感的。这呢是一种这个巴登先生对于中国经济政治的理解。他说这种态度还有一个非常微妙的一点，就是他和各种不同的政治信仰都是兼容的。刚才我们说这个左派民族主义者在中国有一部分，但是持这样一种观点命定注定中国论的人绝对不仅仅是左派。你要是与政治光谱极其右翼的中国人交流，他们也有这样的一种观点。他们认为什么呢？中国必须要成为世界上最好的国家，而中国要成为世界上最好的国家，只有一条必经之路，就是必须要向西方的理想靠拢，不管是法治市场经济个人自由等等等等。换句话说，我们现在中国之所以不好，之所以有各种各样的问题，就是我们没有朝着这一条通向成功的必经之路走。只要中国走向这样的一条路，那中国一定会成为世界上最好的国家。一个共同的前提就是中国是一个注定伟大的国家，尽管现在可能在路线上出了错误。那么这一种观点是巴森先生的观察，我不知道是不是符合何明先生你对于中国某一种独特政治心态的看法
是的，如果用4个字来形容中国那就是中国强大。就是中国不但强，而且要大。这个里面的根本原因，为什么跟南美、跟欧洲、跟美国或者是东南亚其他的国家的心态有一点不一样呢？我也是一直在想这个问题。我的想法就是比较简单，其实习近平也讲过类似这样的观点，就是实际上我们稍微看看人类的几千年的文明历史就发现中国就是一个被喜马拉雅山挡住了这样一个十字军挡住了欧洲的文明，因为丝绸之路 你去想一想，这是一个存在夸张的文学化的这么一个描述，对现代的文明的传播和真正的贸易的影响，那是非常之单薄的。而中国的海洋文明并不是曾经没有过，中国不是一个内陆国家，中国是一个海洋国家，而且有非常长的海洋线，但是它的海洋线呢，也就是在东南亚这个地方就到达了一定的终止，甚至所谓的郑和大西洋，并不是征服这些东南亚国家，而是呢要把东南亚国家的这些移民就是遗留的这个中国的国民呢，要把他们请回去甚至呢还希望建立一个中央王朝，你们所有人都只要称呼我，我都会对你好。那么实际上，它的很长时间的文明的这种拼搏是一个只是速度或者高度的比如说蒙古文明这个清朝文明，它只是高度比汉人高，它可以骑马，对吧？速度比汉人快，用这样一种东西来征服中国，并不是一个真正的工业文明来推动中国的这样一种进步。这样一个问题就是中国太长时间是在一种原始状况，原始状况。所以当他打开大门以后，发现这个世界完全不是他想象的那个金秋世外桃源的这个世界，是一个朝气蓬勃的、高效率的、有很多价值观的这么一个世界。所以中国那种如饥似渴的向西方的学习敬仰，但是他在这个时候又遭到了西方的侵略不管现在人们怎么去解释什么鸦片战争什么八国联军，但是你的军队在中国造成了伤害，这个对中国的民众来讲又是另外一个冲动又是另外一个动力。这种东西呢，对于很多国家来讲，它是没有这个经历。比如说欧洲国家，你讲的西班牙，他们早就开始跟这个工业文明一起成长，对吧？甚至南美都是这样。所以中国它有一种像习近平所讲的那种及时的力量。
对。那么说到这一种力量在政治和经济上是怎样反映呢？巴森先生提出了几种观点。他说说我们看到美国的官僚制度这种制度的基础实际上是成文的议事规则。大家呢，在官僚制度中，人就是个执行者，往往是以价值中立的方式来执行某一些法规的。但是在中国就不一样。在经济方面也是，经济上我们经常提到中国叫国家资本主义什么叫国家资本主义呢？在西方这个语境下，就是政府对于经济有高度的决策权，可以进行干预与市场机制并存与这个分散的价格制定并存，可以主导经济的发展等等等等。但是巴森先生就提出实际上中国的这个经济模式，你也不能说是国家资本主义这么简单，至少是和西方语境中的国家资本主义不一样。在他看来，中国的政治和经济都有一个重要的一个共同点，就是说在这一个官僚制度中，国家官僚不仅仅是认为他们有权利指导国家的发展，有这样的一种义务感，就是政府的职责，政府拥有权利的原因，就是要把整个国家向前来推进。政府的职责不是利用权力提供一个中立的框架，让个人、公司和不同实体在其中作为整个市场参与的角色来实现。这或许是西方自由主义的定义，但是在列宁主义或者叫做中国这样的一个体制下，政府的工作就是推着社会朝某一个方向发展，要有一个基本的政治理想和一个基本的政治理念。经济和政治的原则全部是在这样的一个理念之下动员社会来实现的。国家和政党仅仅接受市场的结果，你就是一无所作不管市场运行的怎样，而是要真的实现不同工具和不同元素的总动员和总结合，推着这个国家往前走。这是他对于整个中国经济政治发展的这样的一个方式，和西方一个非常不同的这样的一点思考。那这个巴斯先生就讲到说这个西方就出现一个什么特点呢？就是平面式的摇摆。他没有这样的一种必须要向前走的推进的欲望，往往大家是选上的，不管是左派的政党还是右派的政党，整个这个官僚机制是处于某一种合规合序这样的一个状态。它呢是在一个比较稳定的状态中有这样的一个激荡，但是中国不一样，中国必须要往前走，不往前走似乎就是失败和落魄。 在过去啊，这个巴森先生也目睹了中国经济中一些让人觉得有一些纠结的怪现象，比如啊，为什么中国的投资率如此之高啊？为什么这个中国虽然没有很好的法律制度，但是仍然保持了高的经济的增长？那么这里啊，他就提到了伦敦政治经济学院的一位政治哲学家，在50、60年代的时候非常的著名啊，叫做奥克肖特。现在我们很多人已经不再听到这个名字了。他就讲到啊，说民主是什么？民主是一种不以目的为导向的政治制度，而是由法律和非政治的官僚性机构组成的中性的机构设置。还有另外一种像中国这样的一个模式，叫 teleocracy。现在我们已经不再提这个词了。这个 teleo 这个词呢，是来自于希腊语，意思是向着某个目的前进。那我们知道50、60年代的时候，这一位政治经济哲学家主要观察到的是苏联，但是啊，在巴森先生看来啊，这样的一个就是我们叫做必须朝着某一种目的，必须不断前进的以动力为核心组织的方式，用在今天习近平时代的中国也同样适用。简单而讲啊，他就讲到说，习近平治下的这个党啊，就像一只鲨鱼。那我们知道，别的动物是可以静止睡觉的，鲨鱼永远都在游动。它只要停止前进，只有一种可能，就是它被吃了，或者它已经死了，就是这样的一种。但是他认为，习近平最大的困境也恰恰在这一种必须要向前进的这样的一种社会总动员的需求中。他认为啊，在过去中国有一个明确的目标和计划，就是我们很穷，我们要富起来，经济增长变成是动员全社会的某一种凝聚力，党的某一种核心的向心力。之前大家经常听说如果啊增长率低于3%，那么共产党就完蛋了。最早是说啊，如果低于8%就完蛋了
，5%就完蛋
，5%就完蛋了。那么就认为呀，好像就是说这个党啊有一个巨大的不稳定性，这个不稳定啊是由经济发展实现与否所决定的。但是巴森先生就提到啊，说这个逻辑是有问题的，是为了取得这个结论而故意设置了这样一个前提。在他看来，经济增长再怎么出现下滑，也不会引发不稳定啊。大家经常会听到说中国呀，经济增长也不是问题，但是就业啊，一旦出了问题，出现很多人失业，就会有问题了。在巴森先生看来啊，这个也是无稽之谈。那么尽管我们说啊，这个经济呀、就业呀和民怨呐老百姓对于政府的满意程度之间呢是有这样的关联，但是在巴森先生看来呀，这个理念在中国呢，有很多的影响力，但是对于描述中国的社会现实并不符合实际。即使是中国出现了就业市场和经济增长的问题，不存在对于政权不稳这样的一个威胁。说这个就业和增长啊，就是保持稳定的某一种必要性，在这个巴森先生看来，最大的受到这一种理念影响的就是中国的已故的前总理李克强。那我们看到李克强在担任总理的时候经常说增长不重要，就业是最重要的。那么劳动力市场是关键决策的驱动因素其他的这些指标什么房地产工业其他都不如就业重要。但是这个用巴森先生的话来看呢，大家对于这样的一种观点趋之若鹜，其实呢是对于中国政治制度本身的某一种偏见，或者是成见，或者是西方化的理解。那我们在这个非专制制度下，在民主国家，大家看到专制政权，往往有这样的一种假设，就是人民生活在专制政权之下是被压迫的，必然对政权不满。如果不是你用大量的金钱来安抚他们，那么这一种不满就会滋生出来，成为推倒你的力量。理论上来讲好像有那么一些道理，但是现在大家看到中国的日常生活并不是某一种乌托邦式的地狱的景象，不是说大家都在某一种这个压制和钳制之下，每个人心中都爆满了政治怨恨你要是不能用钱来收买我，我就推翻你，似乎并不是大家被迫起来造反这样的一个情况。在中国还有一种政治观点非常具有影响力，就是所谓的社会契约以政治自由换取经济自由。只要有足够的经济发展，我们呢就可以让渡政治自由，但是没有经济发展了，我们就要政治自由了。他认为这也是并不准确的一种描述方式。人们对于政府的满意与否与 GDP 数字、经济表现、政治自由之间不存在这样的必然联系。那么当然，如果这些问题变得足够严重仍然可能会腐蚀老百姓对于政府的信心。如果你做得太过分了，像之前疫情封锁期间，可能会出现某一种爆发点。那么 这个巴森先生又提出了一个问题，就是说，既然这个党的这个统治力对于民众的管控力和经济增长和民怨之间好像没有这样的一个必然的联系。那么现在在中国经济出现放缓的情况下，习近平到底以什么来组织整个社会？就这种动力之源，过去是发展，不断的推着大家往前发展，成为了某一种向心力。现在到底是什么？主持人就问了一个问题：现在是不是安全？这个巴森先生对于这样的一个说法也提出了否定的态度。他说：“当然了，我们现在是要不断的讲到安全这个问题，但是你说安全就取代经济成为习近平动员整个社会的完全的核心力量了吗？”他说并不是这样。为什么呢？因为因为安全本身并不是一个让人觉得舒适的一个目标。你把安全定为组织一个社会的动力，你的一个直接的推论就是社会上是不安全的，敌人要来打我们，你真的是要发动战争吗？这对于绝大多数的中国人说并不是一个值得追求的动员的目标，缺乏某一种正向的因素。那习近平到底要什么呢？巴森先生就认为说，习近平真正的问题就是他本身的目标就存在非常大的不稳定性，他并没有清楚地向中国人传达，现在经济发展高速动员那个时代已经过去了，我们现在到底应该干什么？他的确进行了一些非常我们叫做虚化式的这样的一些说法，比如在2017年的时候强调的叫美好的生活人民更加美好的物质和精神生活。但是你说追求美好，这是一个太过于虚幻的概念，因此呢，没有形成对于整个社会新的动员力和组织能力。你说自给自足，这个自力更生就是一种组织能力吗？大多数中国人已经见识到了整个世界的发展，不认为这是一个值得追求的目标。因此他就认为习近平真正的挑战是需要给中国人一个新的意义。这个意义不能是战争，不能是过去那样经济的狂野发展，也不能是一个简单的安全或者是自力更生，这样呢，在很多中国人难以接受的这样的一个目标。习近平，你自己的权力体制是足够严密的，你的统治是不受到可能出现的民乱或者是民怨这样威胁的。那你习近平到底要做什么？这是习近平面临的最大的挑战。那么想对于这个何斌先生也提问呢，那么巴森先生其实提出了几个观点。第一，就是中国这个社会有一个重大的一个叫内在的一个冲动或者是一种必然性，就是他必须找到一个目标或者是一个动力来动员全国的人民凝聚在这个目标，然后呢往前走。它和美国这样平摆的民主体制是有很大的区别的。第二，就是他认为习近平真正的问题是他没有找到一个新的价值意义和方向和驱动力。他之前所说的要么是太模糊，什么叫美好生活，要么就是太过于好斗这个安全不安全，要么就是呢我们说的自力更生自给自足，完全不符合当代中国人对于世界的理解。怎么看巴森先生的观点？
中共毛泽东死了以后中国有强大的力量推动了改革开放，但是中国始终有一个问题没有解决，就是像他所讲的，中国到底要干什么？
对，
所以几任领导人其实都是没有讲清楚。邓小平的什么一手抓硬一手抓软什么4个基本原则或者说了做到白猫什么不管白猫黑猫做的老鼠是好猫，或者是摸到石头过河这种老百姓听起来很听得懂但是呢，它不是一个真正意义的价值目标，没有。那到了江泽民时候呢，就是什么3个代表这样的莫名其妙的东西，代表什么先进文化，代表现在生产力，他也没有讲出一个价值目标，他只是一种自我的认定。到了胡锦涛时候就更加糊里糊涂了，8人8尺，8人8尺，我到现在为止都没搞清楚哪个8人哪个8尺，对吧？然后他还讲出了科学发展观，我就觉得奇怪了，什么叫观？什么叫观？是等观点还是等观察？然后又是科学发展观，所以到了习近平时候提出了一个中国梦那么他围绕着中国梦发表了很多的这个演讲，但他始终没有把这个目标讲清楚。
对，
这就是中国现在的理论来讲，你可以说是理论问题，但是你真正的政权的运行或者国家的目标来讲，是一个非常危险的状况。
对，
就是你没有一个凝聚的一个精神力量， 这就使中国的政治的呈现的方式呢，是用我很不客气的话来讲，就是比较单薄，或者是呢比较单一。虽然这个国家它的思潮很多啊，有传统价值观的，对吧？传统文化怎么厉害，什么儒家文化、这个文化那个文化，对吧？有这样一种学派，或者是有这样一批信众，也有一批人呢是受列宁主义、马克思的影响，或者是什么社会主义，或者所谓的左派。还有一批人啊，就是向往西方啊，把西方的价值观或者西方的法律，或者是西方的某些行为作为衡量中国的一个标准，或者是中国未来发展的一个出路。那么总之，这些现象如果在任何国家里面呈现都是不奇怪的，但是在中国它就有可能会造成混乱。极左的这些人，他可以利用中国社会的不公平来找到他的这个动力的来源。
对，
所以你就会出现所谓的毛派，所谓的什么人，自由派分子呢，就是完全可以无视西方现在存在都自己本身的一些问题，民主也好，法治也好，自由也好，都在面临一个重新的调整和改变的过程，而是把这些事情呢变成中国的一些出路。实际上这些事情你稍微看看全世界的冷战之后的这些发展国家的艰难出路啊，结果你就会很清楚，对吧？那些国家在这方面价值是很明确的啊，就是很快形成了民主社会，很快形成了自由社会，但是他们的经济甚至社会问题没有解决，甚至还陷入到内战。所谓的颜色革命现在已经不提了，对吧？所谓的这个休克疗法现在也不提了，但是造成的恶果实际上也是很清楚的。那么为什么这几种东西都会在中国出现？就是因为作为最高领导人，作为执政党，他始终没有办法讲清楚他的权力来源，他的权力的运行，他权力未来的合法性的基础，甚至未来真正的目标。什么叫中国梦？就是第一个这个词吧，就很虚化，它跟美国梦结合在一起，对吧？那你是不是要平权，对不对？美国梦是平权嘛，那么或者是某一种基础性的生活嘛？那你中国梦就是这么简单的把美国给套上来，就是中国的领导人在理论上、在思想上缺乏这个基本的想象力的一个原因是，他还是被这三种势力在拉扯之中，他没有办法沉淀下来形成一个东西。这是中国现在为了面临真正的一个问题。因为如果这些价值的目标你没有清晰的思考的话，你就没办法去满足这个你未来的这个，你不能永远是追求一个 GDP， 永远追求一个什么扶贫，甚至追求一个厕所革命。这个从社会现象来讲，或者一个阶段性成果来讲没有问题，但是一个国家到底是什么？你像以前的国民党或者以前的孙中山，他们是有他们的一些局限和问题，但是他们很清楚从军政走向这个顺政，从顺政走向宪政，完成他这个现代化的目标。中国你这个也不敢讲，因为你这样讲的话，那等于是走向西方吧。但是很显明，中国不可能走西方已经证明西方的很多问题的这条道路中国这种发展中国家有没有这个承受能力？但是很有可能，但是又不可能回到列宁主义，
对，
更不可能从小农经济的这种古代哪个什么人讲了一个什么东西来作为现代化的引绎。中国如果说你的中国特色是什么，对吧？你是就从邓小平开始到现在都没有讲清楚。在一定程度上我是能够理解的，为什么没讲清楚？就是因为中国的发展就是几种力量在一种偶然、必然民众或者是官员或者是最高领导人，他是这种或者是企业家或者是全球发展的趋势，它是一个混合的一个混沌状况一种混沌状况。你要领导人突然讲出一个什么东西出来，他其实也是非常为难。但是我觉得这种混沌状况，它是在不断的醖酿过程中间，最终会产生这个国家的这个真正的精神的内核。
何明先生，你最后的这一点判断正好与巴森先生的判断相同。他就提出了几点首先他就讲说，现在呢对于中国过度悲观的看法我是不认同的。不管中国现在价值是处于怎样一个模糊期、混乱期，不管在政策层面上是出现了怎样的一种徘徊不确定甚至是经济的发展也是一片唱衰。他说有2点因素我们是不能忽视的。第一点就是什么？就中国仍然是一种自下而上的这种奋发有为的 这样的一种精神和活力。从上而下，我们看到了政策的各种矛盾缺陷，但是从下而上的这一种动力是没有消退的，这是一点。第二点，他提出的是什么呢？就是说，中国现在，你不管你喜不喜欢中国，你认为中国是危险还是世界什么和平的力量，它的这个存量在那儿呢，它的增量可能有所减少，但是它的存量是什么概念？全球制造能力的可能是1/3，甚至是更多，这个数字它就摆在那里。所以就是说，你它的这个存量本身就孕育着一个巨大的势能和动能，增量上可能是出现了变缓放缓的一个趋势，但是这样一个体量的中国不可能太惨，这是他的一个想法。他也想说现在对于中国而言的确是一个非常有趣的时刻，在一些巨大的压力之下，他很乐观的预计中国可能会提出一些新的东西，让我们大吃一惊。我们不能每次都保障中国想出的平衡或是完美的，他原话说，我们也不能保证每一次中国提出的新看法会产生人们想要或者是期望的结果。但是我想说的是，在中国整个体制中，现在是一个充满波动和变化的时刻，留下了这样的一个空间那么我觉得呢，这个巴森先生呢，他自己呢也非常诚实。他说，我之所以对于中国有这样的一些看法，就是我不是一个科班出身的经济学家，我也不是一个科班出身的政治学家。最开始是一个记者，在采访过程中认识到了各种各样的人，在中国呢又真的能够以观察者的方式生活这么多年，因此我觉得他对于中国政治和经济的观察，往往是在一般意义上的悲观和乐观之外，提出了一些值得让我们思索的这样的一些信息。所以在今天的思想先驱报中，我们特别把这一期节目分享给我们的朋友。如果您已经加入了华尔街电视的会员的话呢，您会在第一时间就看到巴森先生的相关观点。我们也会在六度世界思想先驱报专属的会员讨论区和俱乐部中，为大家提供有关于巴森先生有关的相关的其他分析，以及他在自己的博客节目中对于习近平本人的从政历史和中国经济优先事项变化提出的一些真皮实践的见解。好了，以上就是本期思想先驱报的全部内容，我们下期再会。
谢谢。
So, wanted to start by asking how you first became interested in China, and as a related question, how did you find your way to this career of thinking and writing about China's political economy?
Yeah, my career pathway is a bit weird. The way I got into being a China expert, I think, is different from a lot of other people that I know who do similar things. So a lot of the people that I've met over the years do the kind of thing that I do. They got into China-related careers because they had some kind of early life experience that pushed them in that direction. So they studied Chinese in high school maybe, or they have a family connection in China that made it natural to be curious about China. So actually, I don't have any of those things. I'm a white kid. I grew up in a small town in southeastern Louisiana. My exposure to China growing up was that my dad would take us out to a Chinese restaurant on Friday nights. That's kind of it. I basically became interested in China because I lived in China, not the other way around. And that happened through a pretty circuitous chain of events. But basically, when I was trying to break into journalism, get a job, went around talking to people, I was introduced to some people who were involved in journalism in Asia. They introduced me to some people. They introduced me to some people. And I ended up getting connected with this consulting company in Beijing, of all places. And the consulting company was looking for educated young people that they could underpay and exploit. So, naturally, I was interested in that. And, at the time, I hadn't really ever given much thought to China particularly, but here was someone who was willing to pay me to go live in a foreign country, and that seemed like a pretty interesting chance that I shouldn't say no to. So I said, sure, I'll give it a shot. And then I showed up in Beijing and I basically started from scratch. Right? I didn't have any knowledge of Chinese when I first moved here. I didn't have that much background knowledge, didn't have many preconceptions. And because of that, I was immediately confronted with this huge puzzle, right? I'd placed myself in this completely different physical, cultural, social environment, and I had to figure out how it worked. In a sense, that's kind of what I've been doing ever since. I think the other piece of my biography that's maybe relevant to this, and that has kind of shaped my approach, is that my job for a long time now has been to analyze the Chinese economy. I actually wasn't trained as an economist. I was trained as an anthropologist. And at school, my undergraduate degree was in anthropology. We had a very rigorous exposure, I would say, to a kind of more traditional mid-century style of social science, a little bit different than what people get taught today in most places. And kind of the organizing questions that we were asked to investigate was, how do human social systems function, and how do we understand the diversity of human social systems? What are the differences? What do those differences mean? And I think if I look back at stuff I've been doing over the years, basically the question I've been trying to answer in kind of from different angles and in different ways is, what is the nature of China's system? How does its system differ from other systems? And I think the reason I asked the question in that way is because I was exposed to this particular school of social science at a formative age.
Andrew, one of the things I wanted to ask you, and actually I'm going to make this a new feature on the podcast. I always appreciate sections of podcasts where they ask for book recommendations, but I usually find that entails me having to go spend $30 on a book. And then realistically, I'm probably not going to read the book. It's going to end up in the pile here, as you can see behind me. But I've often found sometimes the most helpful tool for me is when someone says something, some sort of framework or heuristic or insight that actually is an aha moment and is a tool that I can then use to bring to bear on thinking about China. So as I wrote to you in an email, I wanted to use you as a guinea pig for a new running feature of the podcast, which is there some sort of, borrowing from Daniel Dennett, an intuition pump or a heuristic or some insight that you have heard or developed that helps you think through China? And just for the audience, I'm not sure this is a heuristic as such, but just to give an example, you often hear some people say, China's not a monolith. Now, that's a really simple comment, but I think people who articulate that, what they're trying to do is to get to a deeper insight where they want folks to embrace complexity of the Chinese system rather than thinking of it as a Xi Jinping in the mothership turning dials to get the system to operate as he wants. You think a lot about thinking about China. So I wonder if I could put the question to you, is there some sort of, again, heuristic intuition pump, insight, framework that you find very useful and might be useful to others?
Yeah, I thought quite a bit about this. It's a tricky question. So I came up with something. I'm not sure it's going to be an aha moment for you, but maybe it'll be helpful for other people, because this is something that's come up in a lot of conversations I've had about China. So one basic kind of simple thing about China that I keep coming back to is that it's really important to realize, I think, that Chinese people mostly believe that China is a great nation that should be at the forefront of the world. So what I mean by this is not that the Chinese people are all these kind of rabid, frothing at the mouth nationalists. That's not all my point. What I mean is more that there's kind of a baseline assumption across all kinds of people that you meet, different classes, different political beliefs, that essentially there's no particular reason why China should not be the best in the world at any given thing, regardless of what that thing is. And if China isn't the best in the world, then it can be, and they just have to work harder to get there. When I was living in China, I've encountered this attitude a lot, so it didn't seem exceptional to me or that remarkable. It was just part of the background. It's just there all the time. As I spent more time in other developing countries and more time in developed countries as well, I've really started to appreciate that this attitude is kind of unusual. There's a lot of small countries or poor countries. The people there are, in fact, not really confident that they can be the best in the world at any particular thing. They're very conscious that they lag behind other countries in the world, that their position is relatively poor. And it doesn't seem necessarily plausible to them that that's going to fundamentally change. And that belief might not be wrong, right? I'm just going to, pick some like country names out of a hat here. So, right, if we're thinking about, are we talking about Spain or Indonesia? Is it really realistic for those countries to have aspirations to be, for example, the global center for artificial intelligence research? Might not be, but it is kind of realistic for China to have those aspirations. And I guess the other thing I would say about this is, again, this is kind of an attitude. It's not a political belief or a political creed. So a lot of Chinese people have this attitude, but it's compatible with like a lot of different political beliefs. So it doesn't determine necessarily like where China ends up. I think if you talk to Chinese people who are more on the right of the political spectrum, in kind of Chinese domestic terms, they may tend to think that the way that China becomes the best in the world like an even better place is by converging with the global ideals of whether this be the rule of law, market economics, individual freedom, and so on. And for Chinese people who are more on the left of the political spectrum, again, in the domestic context, they may tend to think more it's about China following its own path and using the power of the socialist state to shape outcomes. So how China gets to be the best of the world is something that Chinese people are debating amongst themselves. But I think they all share the premise that China is going to keep becoming a better place, that it is a great nation, is going to become an even greater nation in the future. So I think if you wanted to offend every Chinese person across the entire political spectrum, what you would do is to deny that premise or try to throw roadblocks in its way.
Before we get to your blog post, let me ask you one additional high elevation question. I read your professional day job writing and I also read your blog posts. And I like both, but what I especially like about the blog is I can see that you're still puzzling through trying to understand the Chinese political system. And you draw on comparative writings, you sort of puzzle through government documents or party documents that come out. And we're going to talk about one of these posts in a minute. But I wanted to, before we get into that, ask you, we're at a time where I think a lot of people see massive change occurring in China, in its growth model, in its political system. I'm curious, as you draw on your experience in China and analyzing China, and as we record this, you're in Beijing right now. When you think about China's political system or political economy, are there beliefs you had which you now just fundamentally question? Are there beliefs you've long held which still hold constant when you think about the structure of China's political system and its economy? In other words, like, what do you think you know about China in a deep, true sense? And what are the areas of your knowledge about China where the theses are tentative or shifting?
Thank you for putting the question in that way, because it is true that I'm still a student of this stuff and will continue to be a student probably for the rest of my life. So it's a process to figure this stuff out. I think one thing that's changed for me over the last 10 years is that I feel like I do have a better understanding of the Chinese political system than I did before. So I've done a lot more reading about that, and I've also just had more time to observe how things work and talk to people. So at the moment, I have reasonably high confidence in understanding that I understand the basic parameters of the Chinese system. And the key concept for me that's been useful is basically the idea that China is a Leninist system. And this is a technical term, not a term of abuse. I learned this from reading in particular Joseph Fewsmiths, who's a well-known scholar of Chinese politics, and also this guy Ken Jowett, who's kind of an older scholar of the Soviet Union. And a Leninist system, it's fundamentally a hierarchical top-down political system in which the cadres, the members of the Communist Party, are mobilized to pursue political goals. Right? So this mobilization is a key idea, and the political goals are a key idea. And the reason these are important is because China's not actually governed by a neutral civil service or neutral bureaucracy that's based on following written rules of procedure and implementing regulations in kind of a value-neutral way. Right? So if we look at China, we see something that appears on its surface to resemble such a bureaucracy, but actually that bureaucracy is subordinate to the Leninist political system, or to put it a different way, the Leninist political system kind of interpenetrates the bureaucracy at every level. So that's on the political side. And then on the economic side, I've also spent a lot of time trying to figure out what exactly is the nature of China's system. And the term that I come back to, which is maybe not ideal, but seems to be the best that we have available in English anyway, is state capitalism. And so this is what I use. This is just a shorthand term where you have an economy in which there are high levels of government ownership, high levels of government intervention, but these coexist with market mechanisms, the decentralized setting of prices, and so on. So I think in China's case, this kind of political system and this kind of economic system reinforce each other. They're highly compatible obviously for historical reasons, but also in kind of logical way, right? So the key dynamic of a Leninist system, I think, is that the leaders they do not just feel that they are entitled to direct the development of their nation in a particular way, but they're actually obligated to. That's their job. This is the reason the government has power. The government's role is not to use its power to provide a neutral framework for which individual people and companies and different entities can all pursue their own goals and aspirations. This is what I take to be the kind of defining conceit of Western liberalism: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government's job is just to enable all this. In a Leninist system, that's not the government's job. The job is to push the whole society to go in a certain direction. And so if that's the underlying political conception, it's actually difficult to have a fully market-based economy because the government, the state, the party is not inclined to just accept the market outcomes. They're inclined to mobilize the society to achieve certain goals and use the different tools they have available. And that's part of what these state-owned enterprises and different regulatory interventions are for. And in the other direction, right, the fact that you have this whole cavalcade of state-owned enterprises and different government institutions to organize and direct different parts of society justifies or encourages a Leninist approach, because otherwise, what is this stuff for? Why do we have all this state ownership? Why do we have all this state intervention? It must be for some reason. If there's no reason to use it, we could just get rid of it. And so since they don't want to get rid of it, they find reasons to use it. So basically, like, my intellectual process of the last 10 years has been specifically is to try to figure out what's the reason for all the weird things about China's economy that people obsess about. So why do we have such high rates of investment? Why are these kind of boom and bust cycles? Why is China able to have high rates of economic growth, even though it doesn't have very good legal institutions? All these kind of puzzles. In my view, basically, it all comes back to this basic political structure, this basic political economy of having a Leninist system. So that's the thing I feel reasonably certain about for now.
I don't know if you've ever read Michael Oakeshott, the London School of Economics political philosopher who heyday was in the 50s and 60s, but I've often thought about him because he talked about two different conceptions of statehood. One is what he called a normocracy, which is, as you just previously described, which is a political system that is not ends-oriented, but is an institutional setup with laws and apolitical bureaucrats. And then he talks about, contrast that with this conception of teleocracy, obviously coming from the teleos, meaning moving towards an end. And he's writing this in description of the Soviet Union. But I've always liked his work on teleocracy because I think it jives with what you were just saying about China as a system oriented towards objectives or goals. And put a more crude way, I thought about the party as something like a shark. Sharks die if they stop moving forward. But in a fundamental sense, the Chinese system isn't structured absent some conception of a goal to be striving for. You couldn't run it. Cadres wouldn't know what to do if it didn't have that sort of continual churn of plans and objectives and meta objectives, whether these are high-level Marxist aspirations or just 5-year plans. So it is a unique feature of these Leninist systems, which I appreciate you highlighting this because I do think it's important. Let me grab the steering wheel and turn the direction suddenly, if I may, which is I wanted to now start getting into some of the substance of what you've been thinking and writing about, both in your blog post on Xi's new growth thesis, but also some of the other thinking and writing you've been doing about the growth of securitization in the policy agenda in China. And I thought I might start with something which I don't have a clear answer to and think you might take a better stab at it, which is before we talk about securitization or the growth of securitization, I think one is just there's confusion that I hear about how external analysts and observers think about growth and political stability. I often hear people, indeed just in the past few weeks, I've heard various people say on the one hand, Xi Jinping doesn't care about growth. He's willing to supplement growth for higher objectives, whether these be Taiwan or to kind of build a fortress economy that can withstand what he sees as a containment, suppression, encirclement strategy by the United States. Then I'll hear people say, well, if growth falls below 3%, then the Communist Party is doomed, so they have to find ways to revive the economy. And you're probably old enough to remember, too, I think this was back in the mid to late 2000s. I just remember there was always this thing in news articles where it would say if Chinese growth drops below 8%, I don't know why 8% or how we got there, but if it drops below 8%, you're going to see massive instability in the system. So how do you at a higher level think about trade-offs or the connection between rates of growth, and maybe that's not the right way to think about growth, but economic activity and growth and its relationship to political stability in the Chinese context, not in the context of Norway or the United States, where I think the relationship is different. Do you buy the logic that whatever the number is, whether it's 8%, 3%, or 1%, there is an absolute floor underneath which if growth craters, it will have a demonstrative rippling effect of instability? Do you think this is not the right way we should think about how they think about the growth stability relationship, or is my question so incoherent that you have a better way that I could frame this?
Yes, actually, I mean, no. So the answer to most of your questions is no. So yeah, no, I don't think there's a floor to growth that kind of triggers instability. I remember very well this debate over the 8% growth and social stability from back in 2000s. And this was kind of one of my formative experiences as a China analyst, was trying to understand and intervene in this debate. So actually, I have pretty detailed memory of this. So my recollection is when that came up back in the day, it was because somebody had done a calculation. I think it might have been the World Bank, but I'm not sure. And they basically said, oh, if you look at the number of new jobs that are created every year and then you divide that by the GDP growth rate, this shows that each point of GDP growth generates X number of jobs. Therefore, this implies that you need a certain amount of GDP growth to have enough jobs, because based on the population, number of college graduates, you're going to need this number of jobs, and therefore you have to have this number of GDP growth to deliver that. So as economic analysis, obviously this is totally nonsense, or maybe it wasn't obvious because a lot of people said it, but I mean, it's total nonsense. So there's no such thing of a fixed relationship between GDP growth and job creation in any economy anywhere. And anyway, I think the calculations in the Chinese case didn't make that much sense because government actually doesn't have very good data on job creation. So the numbers that we're plugging into that equation were probably bogus in the first place. I think that this kind of argument got traction inside of China and outside of China, but I think it got traction for somewhat different reasons. So I think inside China, the reason it got traction, the reason people found it attractive, is because there's a group of people in China who wanted the government to focus on employment rather than GDP growth, right? So they saw the pursuit of GDP growth as creating all kinds of distortions and problems. Fundamentally, what really matters for people's lives, for prosperity, is job creation. So we should really think about GDP growth as a means of creating jobs rather than as this kind of abstract target we're trying to hit for no particular reason. And that idea, I think, has been quite influential in China. When Li Keqiang, the late lamented, was premier, he often said that employment was the most important thing. So at the level of rhetoric, that seems to be influential. But I think, if you actually look at how he or how other administrations actually ran the economy, it was pretty obvious that it's not true, that the labor market was not what was driving how they managed the economy or what key decisions were being made. It was usually other kinds of cyclical indicators of the economy, the property market or industry or what have you. And I think, to be honest, they probably don't really have enough accurate information about the labor market to use it as a guide to short-term macro policy. Outside of China, I think the reason people latched on to this idea was because it played to certain prejudices or preconceptions about the nature of China's political system. So I think there's a tendency for people to think that, for people in the US particularly, to think that the Chinese people living under an authoritarian regime, that they must inherently always be dissatisfied with the regime and they must always be looking for ways to overthrow it. And then if they're not being constantly pacified with lots of money, they would just rise up the instant that happened. So I think, as with many things, there is a grain of truth of this. So if we look comparatively across different countries, different forms of government, you can correct me on this, but I think the finding is that authoritarian regimes tend to be a little more fragile and have less popular legitimacy than other kinds of political systems. So there is more of an issue for them. But I think we both know that it's just not true that daily life in China is some kind of dystopian hellscape that is going to force people to rise up in revolt. The economy is not so good. And then I think the other idea about political system that's been very influential outside China is this idea that there's a social contract, right? That people in China traded in a more or less explicit way political freedom for economic growth. So we'll accept not having all of these political freedoms as long as enough prosperity is delivered to compensate us for this loss. There is some truth to this. I think economic performance is one of the ways in which the government shows people that it's doing a good job, it deserves their support. But obviously, again, maybe not obviously, but I think this is the case. It's not true that people's satisfaction with the government is mechanically related to the GDP numbers or mechanically related to economic performance in such a specific way. So yeah, I don't think that there is any particular fixed relationship between political stability in the sense of, at least of popular unrest, and economic growth, that there's some kind of trigger that we can identify that when economic problems become serious enough, that that's going to have an impact on the foundations of the political system.
Let me ask you another related question, and this is very much a live topic of discussion now, which is how economic growth is being rebalanced in relation to another goal, which is security or national security. You've written on this, there's stuff on your blog on this, so I don't want to make you regurgitate what you've already said. That being said, I might ask you to regurgitate what you've already said on this. This is a really interesting question for me. Part of it is a little bit of Freudian psychology of people trying to get in Xi Jinping's head. I will hear people say, Xi Jinping doesn't care about growth. I don't agree with that statement, but I understand, as you were just saying, there's a kernel of truth there. We're seeing security rise to the fore of the active policy agenda in ways that are clearly at an elevated pitch from previous leadership groups. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this. If someone says to you, is growth out the window and it's about security, what's your response? If someone says they're trying to balance growth and security, what's your response? How do you think through what, on the surface, to some extent, appear to be zero-sum trade-offs? What's your thesis for what the Chinese are trying to do and how these two objectives sit together or separate?
So the way I think about this goes back to this organizing concept of the Leninist system that's organized around a mobilizational goal for the whole society. So for me, I think the fundamental way to understand what Xi Jinping is doing, particularly since his second term, is that he is changing the mobilizational goal, and that the mobilizational goal had been basically the same from 1978 until 2017, right, when Xi gave his speech at the Party Congress. And in that speech, he basically said in so many words that there had been one goal in the reform era, which was basically the pursuit of economic growth or development, prosperity, different synonyms for this, and that was over, and that now China is on a different trajectory. I think where I would differ slightly from the way that you phrase the question is that I don't think that he's clearly articulated what the new trajectory is. So I think security is part of this new message, but it hasn't been made that clear. So what was very clear and continues to be very clear is that the pursuit of economic growth has been downgraded in importance relative to other goals. It's not gone. They don't care about growth, but the system was previously organized around the pursuit of economic growth, and now it is not. What is the system organized around now? Well, I would say it's not that clear, to be perfectly honest. And this is why I think that in a way that there's a lot of political instability in China. And this goes back to our previous question of where you're asking about political stability in the Chinese context. So I think if you think in terms of this, China having a Leninist political system, where what's fundamentally important is having the mobilizational goal and then communicating that mobilizational goal. In that context, actually, China's in a moment, I would say, of political instability because the new mobilizational goal has not been clearly communicated. There's kind of some directional guidance, but the actual goal is not that clear, right? So when I say that there's political instability, I don't mean that there's different factions within the Communist Party or that there's going to be riots in the street or a coup or anything like that, right? Xi has very tight political control. He has very little room for any competing power centers to emerge. But I think there's instability in the system's own terms, right? Just there's ambiguity about what the mobilizational goal is. There's ambiguity about what people should be doing. right? So he's talked about different things as one of the organizing conceptions in his original speech in 2017 was this idea of a better life. That's about as vague as you can possibly get, right? So that has all kinds of different components. So, we shouldn't pursue economic growth. We should pursue a better life instead. What does that mean in practice? I think nobody knows. More recently, there's been a lot of emphasis on national security, the technological self-sufficiency. I think these are very specific goals, but are they enough to function as like the overall goal for the whole system? I think the problem here is that this talk about national security and self-sufficiency, the only thing that really makes those make sense and seem convincing to people is the fact that there are worries about China getting into a conflict with the US. So you have all these. The US has put tariffs, technological sanctions on China. China clearly has to have a response to this. I think that's why these talk about technological self-sufficiency has gotten a lot of traction and is quite popular in China. But I think it would be quite a difficult thing for Xi to kind of come out and say explicitly that the goal for the nation is to prepare for a war with the US. Because that's not a goal that people are really going to get behind. War is bad. People don't like it. They're not going to go to war if they don't have to. So I think the problem with the security as a mobilizational goal is that it's not an attractive one, fundamentally. You can frame security, the security self-sufficiency issues more as like, we need to do things to protect ourselves, and it's just in case. But I think that doesn't really function as kind of an organizing principle for the whole society. So I think what you've ended up with is this kind of confusing signaling where the government is saying, well, we shouldn't pursue economic growth as aggressively as we did in the past, and we should pursue some of these other things like technological self-sufficiency, like food security, like the preservation of traditional culture. There's a long list of these things, so we should pursue some of these things more aggressively than in the past. But again, that's not that satisfying, and it doesn't fundamentally give the actors in the system very clear guidance about what their priorities should be and how they should make particular decisions. Ultimately, this is my diagnosis about why everyone in China seems so unsettled and seems really uncertain right now. They literally don't know where the country is going. And I don't mean that in kind of like an abstract sense. It's in the sense of the country is organized around having a goal towards which it should be proceeding. And people aren't really sure what that goal is. The Leninist system is unsettled. And therefore, the people who live in this system are also unsettled.
We'll put a link. You had a really good blog post on what must be the level of relative confusion or uncertainty for cadres in the system who are clearly being transitioned to a new paradigm, but without, as you say, laser-like clarity on precisely what's the relative weighting of the various objectives. This does exist at some level in terms of performance indicators that cadres are evaluated on, but it's clear from just anecdotal evidence that those are not sufficient to give actors in the system certainty of action, knowing that basically here's the green zone, here's the yellow, here's the red. And of course, they still live in a world where there still are growth targets and growth expectations, but also, depending on where you are, if you're in Guizhou, you probably also have some expectations. You're going to develop some sort of innovation cluster, but you're also going to have some national security imperatives. So it does seem like Xi Jinping is pushing the system into a new level of dysfunctionality. Let me now ask you to pick up your rusty, dirty crystal ball, brush it off, and see if you can peer into it. I know no one likes to predict the future, especially on China, and I know you're a careful, nuanced thinker. So the answer, I will say it for you on the questions I'm about to ask you, is probably I don't know. But nonetheless, I wanted to get your sense of, you've laid out a picture just now of an incoherent, somewhat confused, functional policy agenda that is sending multiple signals. You probably have actors in the system interpreting those signals differently. You have China dealing with a very different external environment. You know, it had very benign external environment from the late 1990s through till fairly recently. You have a political system that is becoming more, in some sense, more capital L Leninist, but also in some ways de-Leninized as Xi Jinping really personalizes the system. I guess the first question is, how strong, how robust and resilient do you think this political economic system is to withstand internal challenges from Xi Jinping sort of trying to move the system or shift gears and externally, whether it's Chinese corporates now facing a much harder regulatory environment, BRI facing pushback, you kind of pick the policy initiative and there are challenges. I don't think anyone anymore is in the China galactic ascendancy trajectory. Are you China muddles through? Are you China can get its mojo back? Or are you China not on the cliff, but heading in the direction of a more catastrophic hard landing that could be a political hard landing? Or option D, which is whichever option I didn't list that you think is better.
I think there are a lot of issues in the Chinese economy and political system they're trying to deal with. We kind of outlined why it's being proved challenging to deal with them. I would say that in a medium-term sense, my bias is to not be completely pessimistic. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about at the opening of our conversation, where I feel like there's this sort of general sense among Chinese people that China's going to get better, and if they work hard, they can achieve it. So again, I would be frank that this is sort of more of an intuitive sense than something I can justify very rigorously with lots of evidence and statistics. But I do feel like there is a continued momentum in China for it to catch up with the technology and capabilities of other countries, and that catch up can continue to propel China's incomes up over time. But I feel that this is more of a bottom-up process, right? That it's not something that's necessarily driven by all of these government initiatives in terms of industrial policy, R&D subsidies, what have you. And to some extent, this bottom-up dynamism in China exists despite these government policies or even in opposition to them. I think it's still very much a real thing. So we should not assume that it has gone completely away. And I guess the other thing I would say this, just in terms of global perspective, global impact, is that it's hard to imagine a future scenario in which China becomes internationally irrelevant, right? So maybe China becomes more relevant in a good way, maybe it becomes more relevant in a bad way, but it's very unlikely for it to be less relevant. The shape of the world economy has changed, very substantially, and China has huge stocks, for lack of a better word, so huge stocks of manufacturing capacity, of technological capability that are not going to go away, even if the economic outcomes are poor. So maybe the economists like to talk about stocks and flows. So, maybe the flow of new economic activity, i.e. growth, is weak over the next few years, but China's already built up a lot. It's 20-30% of world manufacturing output. That's not going to go away. So I think we should broadly anticipate that even if China faces a lot of challenges, it's going to continue to be relevant in kind of a macro sense, and then also in several very specific senses, right? It seems pretty obvious that China is very far along the way to becoming the global center of production for clean energy technology that the rest of the world is going to use in the transition away from fossil fuels. So that's almost a done deal, it seems like. To go back kind of more generally, your question about how does China deal with these problems, I think in my day job, the problems that we've been trying to figure out is basically what kind of economic policy decisions does China make given its set of priorities and the fact that the priorities now are clearly different than they were in the past. I think over the past 12 months in China, since basically the COVID restrictions were dropped, there's been a lot of flux, a lot of change. And I think there's this kind of ongoing process of everyone within the system trying to get more clarity on what the overall goal is, right? So officials in the government and also people in the population at large, they're trying to decode the signals. And also the people at the top, so Xi Jinping and his associates, are at the same time, they're trying to fine-tune the signals in order to get the results that they desire, right? So you've seen Xi come up with various new formulations that try to synthesize what you talked about as the growth and security concerns, or new formulations that imply that growth and security are not opposed to one another, right? It's not a zero-sum game. We can do both at the same time, and everything will be great. So, in fact, it's a very interesting and uncertain moment for Chinese policymaking. I think there's a general sense that all of the economic problems over the past year have pushed the government to make some tough choices, to kind of face up more explicitly to these trade-offs, and to try to come up with a more coherent policy agenda. So where does this balance between growth and like the rest of the agenda, security concerns, where does this stand now? Obviously, economic growth is pretty poor right now. Property market is in real trouble. And you're seeing at the margin a little bit more of a pivot back towards growth supporting policies. And so that's what a lot of the economic analysis and discussion domestically is about. It's like, oh, we're getting these positive signals finally. So things are good. But I think what the government is trying to do is to find a new synthesis, right? They want to find a way to have decent economic growth, a way to stabilize the current situation that's compatible with this new political agenda that doesn't involve just giving up and saying, oh, we are wrong to try to pursue this new set of goals. We can actually still pursue this new set of goals and also get these good things. I think a lot of people domestically want to see the old system come back. They want to see the old goal come back. So they want China to pivot away from the pursuit of security, a better life, this different political agenda that she has outlined. They want to see the pivot away from that and back towards let's just do economic growth and not worry about the other stuff. And I think if you look back over this past year, you see every marginally positive development in the economy has been interpreted that this has happened. So first, oh, they dropped COVID controls. That means they don't care about this stuff and it's growth all out. No. So then beginning of this year, the new premier, Li Qiang, he made all these nice comments about the private sector when he was appointed. They're like, see, new administration, we're back to the good old days. No. Then we had the Politburo meeting saying, oh, we need to do more to support growth. And people said, oh, look, finally they've seen the light and it's going to be off to the races again. It wasn't. Most recent one, Xi Jinping went to Shanghai and people said, oh, look, this is a signal. There's more focus on economic growth. So I think basically all of these interpretations have been wrong, and people will probably continue to make this kind of interpretation in the future, and it's still going to be wrong in the future. So that's my prediction. So I think the old system where you had this decentralized pursuit of high growth and you kind of tolerate anything as long as it gets growth, this is gone. Xi has killed it. He's not going to bring it back. But at the same time, I think it's true that they haven't figured out what the exact balance they want is between growth and these other concerns. Between growth and security is the way you put it. It's being renegotiated. It's in flux. And so that's why I think right now it's a super interesting moment for Chinese economic policy, right, which is what I look at every day. There's this huge pressure. There's huge political pressure, these huge economic pressures. So the economic problems are very serious. And the political constraints are also very binding. So they need to come up with some new ideas. They need to find ways to help the economy that are going to be consistent with these new political priorities. They have to get growth, but they have to get growth in a way that's compatible with this kind of objective of we need to restructure the economy in a way to help us prevail in the global competition with the US. So I think it's a very interesting moment. It's a very uncertain moment. Almost certainly, China's going to come up with some new things to surprise us as a result of these intense pressures. It's not guaranteed that the balance they find is going to be the perfect one or that it's going to generate the kind of growth outcomes that people want or expect. It is a moment of kind of flux and change, I would say, in the Chinese system. Maybe that's a cop-out.
It's the truth, so it may be a cop-out, but I also don't know a better answer. And anyone selling certainty in this moment is going to have a bridge they're going to sell you next as well. So I find that folks more credible when they're willing to frame it just as you did of this is a moment. You're in Beijing right now, so you'd have a better sense, but I pick up from Chinese friends and interlocutors that same sense of unease where problems China had, to be sure, but there was some certainty in the trajectory, namely tomorrow was going to be better than today. Your kid's life was going to be better than yours. But even with your own lifetime, you were going to have likely ample opportunities for improvement. And that window feels to be collapsing. And I can absolutely see the desire of many to get back to the old growth model. Again, all the pathologies and problems it also had a lot to offer, I think, most Chinese, and we're definitely in new territory. But again, I am just so glad, Andrew, that you're thinking and writing about this. I would like to say that all audience members should go shake their couch cushions and find some money to become clients of Govco Dragonomics. I realize that's probably unrealistic for most. So luckily, Andrew, you are writing frequently and I think with great nuance about a lot of these challenges on your blog, The Tangled Woof. If people are thinking, what the hell does the Tangled Woof mean? You'll have to go to andrewbatson.com. There is an explanation of what that means, but can't recommend your analysis enough, Andrew, and really look forward to reading what you write next. So thank you for your insights. Thanks for your writing and thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Jude. It was a really great conversation.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world尝试吧。